You have nothing without me, Richard Carter said, sliding the divorce papers across the polished oak table as if he were closing a routine business deal, not ending a marriage that had lasted over 20 years, and the quiet that followed wasn't shock, it was acceptance, the kind that settles into a room when everyone believes the outcome has already been decided, when no one expects resistance, especially not from Evelyn Carter, who sat across from him with her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as though she were listening to a weather report instead of being told her entire life amounted to nothing. And she didn't interrupt him, didn't question him, didn't even look at the stack of papers right away. She simply nodded once, slow and measured, as if acknowledging a detail she had already considered long before this moment arrived, while around them the restaurant carried on in its usual rhythm, low jazz humming through hidden speakers, the soft clink of silverware against plates, the muted conversations of strangers who had no idea they were sitting just a few feet away from what Richard clearly believed was a final victory. And he leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the side, confident, relaxed, explaining in a calm, almost instructional tone how everything had already been arranged, how the house was in his name, how the primary business accounts were under his control, how his attorney had ensured that the division of assets would be, in his words, fair, a word he used with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Evelyn finally shifted her gaze down to the documents, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the top page, not flipping through it, not scanning the details, just feeling the weight of it, the texture of the paper, as if confirming something rather than discovering it, and for a brief moment, just a second, her eyes softened, not with sadness but with memory, long nights at the kitchen table with spreadsheets spread out in careful rows, early mornings reviewing contracts before Richard even woke up, years of decisions made quietly, efficiently, without recognition, all of it tucked away behind a name that was never hers, at least not on the surface, and still she said nothing, not when he reminded her that she didn't have independent income, not when he mentioned that hiring a lawyer would only complicate things for her, not even when he repeated, almost casually, that she would be better off accepting the offer as it was, because there was nothing for her to claim anyway, and that was when she reached for the pen, her movement smooth, unhurried, deliberate, and signed her name without hesitation, without review, without a single question, the ink settling into the paper as quietly as everything else she had done throughout their marriage, and Richard exhaled, satisfied, relieved, already moving on in his mind to whatever came next, already certain that this moment marked the end of any uncertainty. But Evelyn closed the folder gently, slid it back toward him, and as she stood, adjusting her coat with the same calm precision she had maintained all evening, she looked at him for the first time with something almost resembling patience, and said, in a voice so even it barely rose above the ambient noise of the room, "You should make sure the bank agrees with you." And then she turned and walked away, leaving behind a man who didn't yet understand that the only thing he had just finalized was the beginning of something he was no longer in control of. The next morning arrived without urgency, the kind of quiet, steady morning that made everything from the night before feel almost distant, almost manageable, and Richard Carter moved through his routine with the same confidence he had carried out of the restaurant, his suit pressed, his shoes polished, his expression composed, as if nothing uncertain remained in his life, as if every outcome had already been accounted for, and by 9:15 a.m., he was walking into the downtown branch of First National Bank, the one his company had used for years, the one where people greeted him by name, where handshakes were firm and familiar, where success was recognized without needing to be explained, and he nodded to the receptionist with a brief smile before asking to speak with his account manager, his tone calm, efficient, already anticipating a smooth transaction because in his mind this was just a formality, a final step in consolidating what had always been his, and when he was led into a glass-walled office overlooking the main floor, he sat down without hesitation, placing the signed documents neatly on the desk, tapping them once with his fingers as if to signal completion, while across from him Daniel Brooks, a man in his early 50s with careful eyes and a practiced professionalism, reviewed the paperwork in silence, his expression neutral, his movements precise, and for a moment nothing seemed unusual, just the quiet turning of pages, the faint hum of the building's air system, the distant sound of keyboards and low conversations outside the office, until Daniel paused, just slightly, his finger resting on a line longer than expected, and Richard noticed it, not with concern, but with mild impatience, leaning back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, waiting for the confirmation he believed was inevitable. And when Daniel finally looked up, his tone remained polite, measured, but there was a subtle shift, something quieter beneath the surface as he said, "Mr. Carter, I just want to clarify something before we proceed." And Richard gave a short nod, confident, almost amused, as if this were simply a procedural delay, and Daniel turned the document slightly, angling it toward him, pointing to a section that most people would have skimmed past, a detail buried in language that required attention to notice, and Richard leaned forward, not because he expected a problem, but because he wanted the process to move faster, and that was when Daniel continued, his voice even careful. "The primary ownership and authorization on this account structure is not listed under your name." And the words did not land all at once, they settled slowly, like something that needed a moment to be understood, and Richard frowned, not alarmed, just confused, as if he had misheard, as if there were a simple explanation waiting to be clarified, and he shook his head once lightly, dismissing the idea before it could fully take shape, saying, "That is not possible," with the same certainty he had used the night before. But Daniel did not argue, did not correct him. Directly, he simply turned another page, sliding a second document forward, one that had been on file longer than Richard realized, one that carried a signature he had not thought about in years, and this time when Richard looked down his expression changed, not dramatically, not yet, just enough to break the rhythm of his confidence as Daniel added, still calm, still professional, "Mrs. Carter has been the primary holder on several key accounts for quite some time." And the room seemed to grow quieter, not because anything had changed, but because Richard was no longer hearing it the same way, and outside the glass walls the bank continued its routine, customers stepping in and out, transactions moving forward, normal, steady, untouched, while inside that office something had shifted, something small but irreversible, and for the first time, Richard did not respond immediately. He just sat there, looking at the page, at the signature, at the detail he had never bothered to question. And somewhere across the city, Evelyn Carter stood at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her expression calm, her posture steady, as if she were simply moving through another ordinary morning. And when the signal turned, she stepped forward without hesitation, knowing exactly where this day was going, even if he did not. Richard did not look up right away, his eyes fixed on the signature as if staring at it long enough might change what it meant, as if familiarity could rewrite reality. And for a few seconds the room held that fragile illusion, the quiet belief that there had to be a simple explanation, some administrative error, some outdated document that had not been properly updated. And he cleared his throat, leaning back slightly, regaining a fraction of his earlier composure, saying, "That must be an old structure," with a tone that suggested the matter was already resolved, already beneath concern. But Daniel did not respond immediately. He simply reached for another file, one that had been organized with the same careful precision as everything else in the room, and opened it without hesitation, turning it toward Richard so there would be no confusion, no ambiguity, just clear, documented facts. And this time the dates were recent, the authorization forms updated, the signatures consistent, and the pattern unmistakable, and Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to break the rhythm of his confidence, and Daniel spoke again, still calm, still professional. "The current structure reflects changes made over the past several years," and he paused, just long enough to let that settle before adding, "All of them were properly executed and approved." And that was when the silence shifted, no longer neutral, no longer procedural, but heavier, more deliberate, as if the room itself had started paying attention. And Richard leaned forward again, this time not out of impatience but necessity, scanning the documents more carefully, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding himself in something solid, something that did not move, because the information in front of him clearly had. And he began to speak, stopped, then tried again, his voice lower now, more controlled. "Why was I not notified?" And Daniel met his gaze without hesitation, not confrontational, just direct, and said, "You were listed as an authorized user on certain accounts but not the primary holder." And the distinction landed harder than the previous explanation because it was precise, because it was intentional, and because it implied something Richard had not considered, not even once. And outside, a customer laughed softly at something near the teller line, a normal sound, ordinary, almost out of place against the tension building inside the office. And Richard sat back again, slower this time, his movements measured, as if he were recalibrating, trying to reconstruct a timeline that no longer aligned with what he believed to be true. thinking back through years of transactions, decisions he had approved without review, documents he had signed without reading closely, because there had never been a reason to question them, because control had always felt assumed, automatic, unquestioned, and now that assumption was sitting in front of him in ink and paper, quietly dismantled, and Daniel closed the file gently, not with finality but with clarity, and said, "We can proceed with any requests that fall within your authorization level." And there was no emphasis in his voice, no judgment, just a statement of fact, and for the first time Richard did not have an immediate response. He just nodded once, a small, controlled movement, as if acknowledging something he had not yet fully processed, and across town, Evelyn stepped into a small office building with a simple glass door, the kind most people would walk past without noticing, and inside, a receptionist greeted her by name without needing to ask, and she returned the greeting with a quiet smile, removing her gloves and placing them neatly into her bag, her movements calm, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world, and when she was led down a short hallway into a private office, she did not sit right away. She walked to the window first, looking out at the street below, the steady flow of cars, the predictable rhythm of a city that moved forward regardless of what changed beneath the surface, and when she finally turned back, taking her seat, she said simply, "I assume he has started asking questions," and the man across from her nodded once, already prepared, already aware, and Evelyn folded her hands lightly in her lap, her expression composed, her voice even as she added, "Good." And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing urgent left to say. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion long before Richard Carter ever realized he was no longer in control. Richard remained seated for a moment longer after Daniel finished speaking, not because he had more to say, but because standing up too quickly would have revealed something he was not ready to show, and when he finally did rise, his movements were controlled, deliberate, the same way they had always been, but there was a subtle hesitation now, a fraction of a second where certainty used to be, and he gathered the documents without looking at them again, sliding them into his leather folder as if closing the issue would somehow contain it, and Daniel stood as well, offering the same polite nod he gave every client, no more, no less, and Richard returned it automatically, already turning toward the glass door, already stepping back into the main floor where everything continued exactly as it had before, the tellers assisting customers, the quiet hum of routine transactions, the steady rhythm of a system that did not adjust itself for anyone's realization. And as he walked out of the bank into the cool morning air, he paused just briefly on the sidewalk, not enough for anyone passing by to notice, but long enough for him to take a breath that felt slightly different than the ones before, as if something had shifted just beneath the surface, something he had not yet named, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, scrolling quickly through contacts before selecting one without hesitation, his attorney, and when the call connected, his tone was steady, almost casual as he said, "I need you to review something." Not explaining further, not yet, because explanations required clarity, and clarity was still forming. And across town, Evelyn sat across from Michael Lawson, a financial advisor who had known her long enough to understand that she did not schedule meetings without purpose, and he had already placed a folder on the desk between them, not thick, not overwhelming, just precise, organized and ready, and she opened it slowly, her fingers moving with the same quiet confidence she had shown the night before, scanning the pages not to learn, but to confirm, and Michael spoke in a low, measured tone. "Everything is in place." And she nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, just acknowledging what she had already anticipated, and he continued, "The transfers will finalize by the end of the week, and the remaining accounts are already secured under your authorization." And she closed the folder gently, resting her hand on top of it for a moment as if grounding the decision in something tangible, and then she leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed but precise, and asked, "Any exposure?" And Michael shook his head, answering immediately, "None that he can access without your approval." And there was no tension in the room, no urgency, just the quiet efficiency of a plan executed exactly as intended, and Evelyn allowed herself a small pause, not to reconsider but to observe, to let the moment settle in its proper place, because for years, control had not been something she claimed, it had been something she built quietly, piece by piece, decision by decision, often unnoticed, often unacknowledged, and now it existed fully, not as a reaction, but as a structure that had been there long before anyone thought to question it. And she stood, smoothing the front of her coat, her movements unhurried, composed, and as she reached the door, Michael added, he will push back. Not as a warning but as a fact, and she paused just slightly, her hand resting on the handle, before replying in the same calm tone she had maintained from the beginning. Of course he will. And then she stepped out into the hallway, into the same steady rhythm of the day, while miles away, Richard stood in his office staring at a screen that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Numbers that had always aligned now requiring verification. Accounts that had always responded now needing confirmation. And for the first time, he did not move immediately, he just stood there looking, thinking, recalculating, because what he had believed to be his foundation was no longer something he could assume. And the realization was not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. Richard's office felt different that afternoon. Not because anything had changed physically, the same glass walls, the same skyline stretching across the horizon, the same framed certifications aligned perfectly behind his desk, but because for the first time in years, he was not certain how much of it actually belonged to him, and that uncertainty moved quietly through the room, settling into the spaces where confidence used to sit without question. And he stood near his desk with his phone pressed to his ear, listening as his attorney spoke in a tone that was careful, precise, and noticeably slower than usual, the kind of tone professionals use when they are choosing words with intention. And Richard paced once, then stopped, his hand resting against the edge of the desk, grounding himself as he asked, "Explain that again." Not because he had not heard it, but because repetition might somehow make it less real. And on the other end, his attorney did not hesitate, outlining the structure clearly, the ownership layers, the way certain accounts had been established under Evelyn's primary authorization, the way the business had been legally separated into segments that Richard had assumed were unified. And with each sentence, the picture became sharper, not louder, just clearer, and Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, not yet, but in recognition, the slow understanding that something fundamental had been operating beyond his attention for years. And when the call ended, he did not move right away, he simply stood there, looking out at the city, the traffic below moving in steady lines, predictable, controlled, everything behaving the way it should, except for the one system he thought he understood completely. And he reached for his laptop, opening it with a measured motion, pulling up account summaries, internal reports, cross-checking numbers that had always aligned before, and now required confirmation, and one by one the details matched what he had just been told, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently, quietly reinforcing the same conclusion. And he exhaled slowly, setting his hands on the desk, his posture still composed, but his thoughts no longer linear, because this was not a single mistake, not a single oversight. It was a pattern, deliberate, structured, and maintained over time. And across town, Evelyn stepped into a small cafe just off a side street, the kind of place that did not attract attention, where the lighting was soft and the conversation stayed low. And she ordered tea, nothing complicated, nothing that required thought, before taking a seat by the window, her coat draped neatly over the back of the chair, her posture relaxed but precise. And she did not check her phone immediately, did not rush to confirm anything, because there was no urgency left in her process. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion. And when her phone finally vibrated lightly against the table, she glanced at the screen once, recognizing the number without reacting, and let it continue ringing for a few seconds longer than necessary before answering, her voice calm, even as she said, "Yes." And on the other end, Richard did not begin with anger, did not raise his voice. He asked a question, direct, controlled, "What did you do?" And Evelyn did not answer immediately. She took a small sip of her tea, setting the cup back down with quiet precision, and then said, "I made sure everything was exactly where it needed to be." And there was no edge in her tone, no defensiveness, just clarity. And Richard's silence on the other end lasted longer this time, not because he lacked words, but because he was recalculating them, trying to find a position that still held something that had not shifted beneath him. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "You think this changes anything?" And Evelyn looked out the window for a moment, watching a car pass slowly through the intersection before replying, "It already has." And the line went quiet again, not with tension but with understanding, because for the first time, both of them were speaking from the same reality, and only one of them had been there from the beginning. Richard did not call back after that, not immediately, not within the hour, and that absence of reaction was not restraint, it was calculation, the kind that happens when someone realizes they are no longer moving first. And in his office, the late afternoon light stretched across the floor in long, quiet lines, catching the edges of his desk, the frame of the window, the still surface of everything that had once felt fixed. and he sat down slowly, not out of fatigue, but because standing no longer gave him the same sense of control, and he began to go through the documents again, not the summaries, not the assumptions, but the actual structures, the filings, the signatures, the dates, tracing them back one by one, and what he found was not a sudden change, not a single shift, but a gradual pattern, subtle, consistent, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, which he had never been, because he had never needed to question what he believed was already his, and each layer revealed the same thing. Evelyn had not taken anything from him. She had positioned everything around him, carefully, quietly, until the center of control no longer required his presence, and that realization did not arrive as shock, it arrived as clarity, the kind that removes options instead of creating them. And across the city, Evelyn finished her tea and stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air cooler now, the day beginning to shift toward evening, and she walked without rushing, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if nothing urgent remained, and when she reached her car, she paused for just a moment before opening the door, not to hesitate but to observe, to let the stillness settle, because for years she had operated inside structures built by someone else's name, someone else's assumptions, and now those structures had simply returned to their actual alignment, and she drove without music, without distraction, the quiet of the car matching the quiet of her thoughts, and by the time she arrived home, the house was exactly as she had left it, orderly, composed, unchanged on the surface, and she stepped inside, placing her keys on the table with a soft, familiar sound, removing her coat and hanging it neatly, her movements precise, controlled, and in another part of the city, Richard remained at his desk, the skyline now dimming as the sun lowered, the lights in the buildings beginning to turn on one by one, and he reached for his phone again, not to call her, not yet, but to send a message, short, direct, "We need to meet." And he stared at the screen for a moment after sending it, as if expecting an immediate response, as if the timing of things still belonged to him, but minutes passed, then more, and nothing appeared, and he set the phone down, his hand lingering on the desk, his fingers tapping once lightly before going still again, and in that quiet, something became clear to him that had not been before. This was not a negotiation, not a misunderstanding, not even a conflict in the way he had always defined it. It was a structure already completed, a system already in place, and he was only now seeing the outline of it. And when his phone finally lit up, the message was simple, just one line: tomorrow, 10 a.m. And nothing else, no explanation, no adjustment, just a time. And Richard read it twice, not because it was unclear, but because it was not his, and for the first time, he understood what that meant, not fully, not yet, but enough to recognize that whatever came next would not begin where he expected it to. And across the house, Evelyn turned off the kitchen light, the room settling into darkness behind her, and walked upstairs without looking back, because there was nothing left there that required her attention. At 9:58 a.m., Richard was already seated in the conference room, not because he wanted to be early, but because arriving late was no longer an option he could afford, and the room itself was exactly what it had always been: glass walls, a long polished table, a city view stretching out behind it, everything designed to suggest clarity and control, and he placed his phone face down on the table, his hands resting on either side of it, still, measured, as if holding his position in place, and when the door opened at exactly 10 a.m., Evelyn stepped in without hesitation, her movements calm, her posture straight, her expression neutral, as if this were a scheduled meeting like any other, not something that had been building for years beneath the surface, and she took the seat across from him without asking, setting a thin folder on the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, not opening it yet, not rushing anything, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, just precise, controlled, and Richard was the one who broke it, his voice steady, deliberate. "You moved assets without informing me." And Evelyn looked at him, not with challenge, not with apology, just with clarity, and said, "I managed what I was responsible for." And the distinction was small, but it shifted the frame of the conversation immediately, and Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the table, grounding himself again. "You restructured accounts." And she nodded once, confirming, not elaborating, and he continued, "You did that while we were still married." And she held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Yes." And there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to soften the answer, just acknowledgement. And Richard paused, just briefly, recalibrating, because the conversation was not moving the way he expected, not responding to pressure the way it always had before, and he reached for the folder in front of him, opening it, sliding a document across the table toward her. "These are the terms," he said, his tone firm, controlled. "We can still settle this cleanly." And Evelyn glanced down at the paper, not picking it up, not reading it fully, just letting her eyes move across the top line before looking back at him, and she said, "You already signed." And the sentence was simple, but it closed something he had not realized was still open, and Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he understood what she meant. The document from the night before, the one he had considered a formality, had already set the direction of everything that followed, and he sat back slowly, his posture shifting just enough to show that he was no longer leading the conversation, even if he had not fully accepted it yet. And Evelyn finally opened her folder, turning it toward him, not pushing it forward immediately, just positioning it where he could see, and inside were documents similar to his, structured, precise, complete, but with details he had not accounted for: ownership lines, authorization levels, timelines that extended further back than he had ever considered. And she slid it across the table with the same controlled motion he had used the night before, mirroring him without emphasis, and said, "These are the actual terms." And for a moment the room was quiet again, not empty, but full of something that had finally settled into place, and Richard looked down at the pages, his eyes moving slower now, more carefully, because this time, he understood that missing a detail would not be a small mistake, it would be the difference between assumption and reality. And across the table, Evelyn remained still, her hands resting lightly on the surface, her expression calm, not waiting for a reaction, not needing one, because the outcome was no longer dependent on what he said next. And for the first time since he had walked into the bank the day before, Richard did not speak immediately, he just read, and the longer he did, the quieter the room became, until even the city beyond the glass seemed distant, like something happening in another place entirely. Richard did not turn the page right away, not because he had finished reading, but because he had reached the point where reading was no longer about information, it was about confirmation, and confirmation required something he had not needed before: patience, and his fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper, holding it in place as if the structure beneath it might shift if he moved too quickly. And across from him, Evelyn remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady but not pressing, giving him the space to see what had always been there, because this was not something she needed to explain, it was something he needed to recognize. And when he finally did turn the page, the movement was slower than before, more deliberate, his eyes tracking each line with a level of attention that had been absent for years, and the pattern continued, not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent, reinforcing the same quiet reality. The assets he believed were unified had been separated, the authority he assumed was shared had been defined, and the decisions he thought he controlled had been documented in ways that no longer required him at all. And he exhaled once, not sharply, not in frustration, just a controlled release of something he could no longer hold in place, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes lifting from the document to Evelyn, studying her now in a way he had not done in years, not as someone who supported his structure, but as someone who had built one of her own within it. And he spoke, his voice measured but lower now, more precise. "How long?" And she did not hesitate, did not look away. "Long enough." And the answer did not give him a number, but it gave him something else, a timeline that extended beyond the moment, beyond the argument, beyond even the decision to separate. And he nodded once, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because the question he had asked was not the one he needed answered. And he looked back down at the documents, his hand moving to the next section, where the language shifted from structure to outcome, and this was where the details became undeniable. The distribution already defined, the authority already reassigned, the pathways already closed, and he understood then that this was not negotiation material, it was a record, a reflection of something already completed. And the room remained quiet, but it was no longer neutral, it carried the weight of understanding, the kind that settles when there is nothing left to dispute, only to accept. And Richard placed the document down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table as if maintaining order might restore something he had lost. And he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasping together, his tone steady but changed. "You planned this." And Evelyn's expression did not shift, she simply said, "I prepared." And again the distinction mattered, because one implied intent against him, the other implied responsibility for herself, and Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, searching not for emotion, but for inconsistency, something that did not align, something he could use to reposition the conversation. But there was nothing, only the same calm, controlled presence that had been there from the beginning, and he looked away first, his attention returning to the documents, because that was where the truth existed now, not in what was said, but in what had been written long before this meeting began. And outside the glass walls, the city moved as it always did, cars passing in steady lines, people walking with purpose, unaware that inside that room, a different kind of structure had just become visible, one that had been built quietly, without announcement, without recognition, and now stood fully formed. And Richard sat back again, slower this time, his posture no longer signaling control but adjustment, the process of realigning himself within a framework he had not created. And he asked one final question, not with challenge but with clarity: what happens next? And Evelyn folded her hands lightly on the table, her voice even, composed. You follow what is already in place. And there was no emphasis, no instruction, just a statement of fact. And for a moment neither of them moved, because the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, not with resolution, but with understanding. And Richard looked down at the documents one last time, not searching for errors now, but seeing them for what they were, a complete structure, precise, deliberate, and entirely outside of his control. And across from him, Evelyn remained still, not waiting for agreement, not expecting resistance, because what mattered had already been decided long before he ever realized there was something to decide. Richard did not reach for the documents again after that, not because there was nothing left to read, but because he understood that reading them would not change what they represented. And for the first time since the meeting began, he allowed his hands to rest without purpose on the table, no longer adjusting, no longer aligning, just still, as if acknowledging that control was not something he could reclaim through movement. And the silence between them settled into something final, not tense, not unresolved, but complete. And he looked up once more at Evelyn, not searching for weakness now, not expecting explanation, but seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, not as someone within his structure, but as someone who had stepped outside of it long before he noticed. And he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, not agreement, not approval but recognition. And then he stood, his chair sliding back with a soft sound against the floor, the kind of sound that marked an ending without announcing it. And Evelyn remained seated for a moment longer, not because she needed to stay, but because she did not need to follow his timing. And when she finally stood, it was with the same calm precision that had carried her through every moment leading up to this one. And neither of them reached for the documents again, because they both understood that what mattered was no longer on the table. It had already been decided long before either of them walked into the room. And Richard walked to the door first, pausing only briefly as his hand touched the handle, not turning back, not speaking, just standing there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if marking the space in his memory. And then he stepped out into the hallway, where the world continued exactly as it always had, employees moving between offices, quiet conversations, the steady rhythm of a system that did not adjust itself for personal realizations. And Evelyn followed a moment later, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, and they walked in opposite directions without acknowledgement, without looking back, because there was nothing left to resolve between them, only the continuation of what had already been set in motion. And outside the building, the air carried the faint warmth of late morning, the city moving in steady lines, traffic lights changing, people crossing streets, everything operating within its own structure. And Richard stood on the sidewalk for a moment, his phone in his hand, the screen dark, not because there were no messages, but because there was nothing he needed to respond to immediately. And he looked up at the buildings around him, the glass, the steel, the order of it all. And for the first time he understood that structure was not the same as control, that ownership was not always visible, and that assumption was not a guarantee. And he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in adjustment, the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted. And across the street, Evelyn reached her car, unlocking it with a small familiar motion, placing her bag in the passenger seat before sitting down behind the wheel, her hands resting lightly against it for a moment, before starting the engine. And she did not rush to leave, did not look back at the building, because there was nothing behind her that required confirmation. And as the car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the flow of traffic, her expression remained calm, unchanged, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had already been accounted for. And somewhere behind her, inside a building filled with glass and quiet conversations, a man who had once believed he controlled everything was standing still for the first time, not because he had been stopped, but because he had finally seen the limits of what he never thought to question, and that realization, quiet and precise, would follow him long after the moment had passed, because it was not something that could be undone, only understood, and Evelyn drove forward without hesitation, the city opening ahead of her in steady lines, the road clear, the direction already chosen, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left for her to wait for.